Murder Maplewood Market, written by Catherine Waltan. Welcome to Maplewood, where the scones are sweet, the gossip is spiced, and murder is always on the menu. Retired baker Helen Morrison was expecting a quiet life filled with pies, pups, and peaceful walks through her charming hometown. But when the town's most disliked antique dealer turns up dead behind his shop, and her mischievous Labradors sniff out the body, Helen is thrust into a mystery that's anything but cozy. With the help of her lovable canine duo, Halo and Shadow, Helen must unravel secrets buried deeper than her famous apple crumble. But in a town full of quirky characters and past grudges, solving this murder might be the toughest recipe she's ever tackled. Perfect for fans of small-town charm, clever sleuths, and heartwarming canine sidekicks. Chapter 1: Festival Day. The autumn air in Maplewood carried the scent of cinnamon and apple pie, mingling with the earthy smell of fallen leaves that crunched underfoot. Helen Morrison adjusted the wicker basket on her arm, careful not to jostle the dozen fresh-baked scones nestled inside, still warm from her oven. At 62, she moved with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd spent 30 years running the town's beloved bakery, though retirement had given her a softer pace and, admittedly, a few extra pounds from sampling her own creations. "Come on, boys!" she called to her two 3-year-old Labradors, who were engaged in their morning ritual of sniffing every interesting smell along Maple Street. Halo, her golden yellow lab, had his nose buried in Mrs. Patterson's prize-winning rose bushes, his tail wagging with such enthusiasm it created a small windstorm of petals. Shadow, his black-coated brother, sat patiently by Helen's side, though his dark eyes tracked every squirrel with the intensity of a seasoned hunter. The Maplewood Harvest Festival had transformed the usually quiet town square into a bustling marketplace of colorful tents, hand-painted signs, and the cheerful chaos that only small-town events could produce. Helen smiled as she spotted familiar faces. Mayor Thompson manning the dunking booth with his usual good humor, the Riverside twins selling their famous maple syrup, and old Pete tuning his fiddle for the afternoon concert. "Helen, over here!" called Martha Kowalski from behind the pie contest table, her gray curls bouncing as she waved enthusiastically. "I saved a spot for your scones right next to my apple turnovers." Helen made her way through the crowd, gently tugging Halo away from a particularly interesting hot dog wrapper. Shadow followed close behind, his calm demeanor a perfect counterbalance to his brother's boundless curiosity. The festival buzzed with the comfortable energy of a community that had gathered for this same celebration for over 50 years. "These smell absolutely divine," Martha said, lifting the checkered cloth covering Helen's basket. "Is that your grandmother's cinnamon chip recipe?" "With a little twist," Helen admitted, setting the basket down carefully. "I added a touch of cardamom this year. Thought I'd be adventurous in my retirement." As if summoned by the word adventurous, Halo suddenly perked up, his ears swiveling towards something far more interesting than baked goods. A fat, gray squirrel had made the tactical error of scampering across the open space between the pie tent and the pumpkin display. What happened next unfolded with the slow-motion horror of an inevitable disaster. Halo lunged forward, his retractable leash singing as it extended to its full length. Helen, caught off guard while chatting with Martha, felt the handle slip from her fingers. 20 pounds of enthusiastic Labrador hit the end of the leash at full speed, changed direction with the agility of a much smaller dog, and launched himself directly into the carefully arranged pie contest display. "Halo, no!" Helen cried, but it was far too late. The golden tornado that was her dog managed to knock over 3 pumpkin pies, 2 apple crisps, and something that looked suspiciously like Mrs. Henderson's famous chess pie, before getting thoroughly tangled in the tablecloth. The squirrel, meanwhile, sat on a nearby fence post, chittering what could only be described as laughter. "Oh my goodness, I'm so sorry." Helen rushed forward, trying to extract her sheepish-looking dog from the wreckage while Martha and several other festival-goers attempted damage control. Shadow, demonstrating the wisdom that came with being the sensible brother, had remained exactly where Helen left him, though his dark eyes held what she could swear was amusement. "It's all right, dear," Martha soothed, though her voice was slightly strained as she surveyed the sticky mess. These things happen. At least it wasn't the preserves table. Arthur Greaves chose that moment to appear, as if drawn by the scent of chaos like a grumpy, gray-haired vulture. The owner of Maplewood Antiques had never met a complaint he couldn't voice, or a situation he couldn't make worse with his particular brand of sour commentary. "Typical," he muttered, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Can't even control her mutts. This is exactly why pets shouldn't be allowed at community events." Helen felt her cheeks flush, not with embarrassment, but with the slow burn of irritation. She'd been coming to this festival for 20 years, first as a vendor and now as a participant, and Halo's exuberant accident was hardly worthy of Arthur's theatrical disdain. "They're well-behaved dogs," she said evenly, finally freeing Halo from the tablecloth. A bit of pumpkin pie filling clung to his golden fur, making him look both guilty and oddly festive. "Accidents happen." "Well-behaved?" Arthur snorted. "That animal just destroyed half the pie contest. In my day, people had control over their animals." "In your day, people were probably a lot more understanding about honest mistakes," Helen replied, her baker's patience wearing thin. She'd dealt with difficult customers for 3 decades, but Arthur had always been in a category of his own. Martha stepped between them with the diplomatic skill of someone who'd been organizing community events for most of her adult life. Now, let's just clean this up and move on. Helen, why don't you take the boys for a walk? The festival will be here all day." Helen nodded, recognizing the wisdom in a strategic retreat. She gathered Halo's leash and checked that Shadow was still at her heel. "I'll pay for any damages, of course." "Don't you worry about it," Martha whispered. "Most of these pies were going to be eaten anyway, though you might want to give Arthur a wide berth today. He's been in a particularly foul mood." As Helen led her dogs away from the pie tent, she couldn't help but notice the small crowd that had gathered to watch the drama unfold. Among them were 3 faces that would, in hindsight, prove far more significant than she could have imagined. June Butterworth stood near the bird-watching information booth, her wild gray hair escaping from what had probably started as a neat bun. She wore her trademark binoculars around her neck and a jacket covered in patches from various birding organizations. June was watching Arthur with an expression that could only be described as venomous, her usual cheerful demeanor nowhere to be seen. Across the square, Ricky Doyle was setting up his food truck, Doyle's Rolling Kitchen, for the lunch rush. The 30-something entrepreneur had arrived in Maplewood 6 months ago with his charming smile, his stories of big city restaurant experience, and his surprisingly good chili. But today, his usual easy confidence seemed forced, and Helen noticed him glancing repeatedly toward Arthur with obvious irritation. The third member of what Helen would later think of as the festival's triangle of tension was Tabitha Lane, standing elegant and perfectly composed near the craft tent. The former actress had moved to Maplewood 2 years ago, claiming she wanted the peace of small-town life after decades in regional theater. At 55, she maintained the posture and presence of someone accustomed to being watched, though today her attention was fixed entirely on Arthur Greaves with an intensity that made Helen slightly uncomfortable. "Come on, boys," Helen murmured, deciding that Martha's suggestion of a walk was increasingly appealing. "Let's go see what other trouble we can avoid getting into." But as they strolled through the festival, Helen found herself thinking about the brief drama at the pie tent. Arthur had always been unpleasant, but there had been something different about the reactions he'd provoked today. The looks June, Ricky, and Tabitha had given him weren't just annoyance or frustration. They carried the weight of something deeper, something more personal. Halo, apparently having learned nothing from his earlier adventure, tugged toward a booth selling caramel apples. Shadow, ever the gentleman, maintained his position at Helen's left heel, though she caught him eyeing the apple booth with polite interest. "1 apple," she told the teenage vendor, "and make sure it's for dogs, not people." The girl looked confused until Helen explained about chocolate and xylitol, earning herself a look of admiration for her pet knowledge and a plain apple slice for each dog. As they found a quiet spot on the bench near the gazebo, Helen couldn't shake the feeling that this year's Harvest Festival carried an undercurrent of tension she'd never noticed before. Arthur's unpleasantness was nothing new, but the intensity of the negative reactions he'd provoked felt different, sharper somehow. She watched families enjoying the autumn afternoon, children running between booths with cotton candy sticky fingers, couples browsing the handmade crafts, and elderly residents catching up on months of gossip. This was Maplewood at its best, the kind of community gathering that reminded everyone why they'd chosen to build their lives in this particular corner of the world. Halo finished his apple and immediately began investigating the interesting smells around the base of the bench. Shadow, having eaten his treat with more dignity, settled beside Helen's feet with a contented sigh. These moments of peace were exactly why she'd moved to a house with a proper yard after retiring, why she'd adopted 2 energetic dogs despite her friends' warnings about the work involved. "Helen!" called a familiar voice. Sheriff Mike Brady approached with his usual unhurried stride, coffee cup in hand, and his uniform looking only slightly rumpled despite the busy festival day. Mike had been sheriff for 15 years, and his approach to law enforcement emphasized community connection over rigid authority. "Afternoon, Mike? Busy day?" The usual festival excitement, lost kids, parking disputes, and Mrs. Henderson convinced someone stole her prize-winning chess pie. He raised an eyebrow. "Don't suppose you know anything about that?" Helen felt her cheeks warm. "Halo had a small incident with the pie table. I offered to pay for damages." Mike chuckled. "Martha told me. She also said Arthur Greaves was being his usual charming self about it." "He wasn't thrilled," Helen admitted, "though I get the impression Arthur isn't thrilled about much these days." "You're not wrong there." Mike's expression grew more serious. "Had 3 different complaints about him just this week. Seems he's been having disputes with half the town." Something in his tone made Helen look up sharply. "What kind of disputes?" "Oh, the usual small-town drama, business disagreements, personal conflicts. Nothing criminal, just folks who don't get along." Mike drained his coffee cup. "Still, makes for a long week when everyone wants me to solve their neighbor problems." He nodded toward the festival. "Better get back to it. Keep those boys out of trouble, will you?" As Mike walked away, Helen found herself studying the festival crowd with new eyes. She'd always prided herself on knowing everyone in Maplewood, at least by sight. But today she was seeing familiar faces through the lens of Mike's comment about Arthur's disputes. June Butterworth was setting up her bird-watching demonstration near the gazebo, her movements sharp and efficient despite her earlier obvious agitation. Ricky Doyle had a line of customers at his food truck, his smile bright and professional as he served up lunch portions. Tabitha Lane browsed the craft booths with the unhurried elegance of someone with nowhere urgent to be. All 3 looked perfectly normal, perfectly innocent, perfectly like the neighbors and community members Helen had known them to be. Yet something nagged at her, some instinct honed by 30 years of reading customers' moods and managing the complex social dynamics of a small-town business. "What do you think, boys?" she asked her dogs. "Should we head home, or stay for the afternoon concert?" Halo looked up at her with bright, attentive eyes, his tail thumping against the bench. Shadow stretched and yawned, clearly voting for a nap in their sunny backyard. But before Helen could make a decision, the peaceful afternoon atmosphere was shattered by a commotion near the antique shop. Raised voices carried across the square, though the words were indistinct. Helen could see a small crowd gathering near Arthur's shop, which sat just off the main festival area. Mike Brady was already moving in that direction, his relaxed festival demeanor replaced by professional alertness. "Come on," Helen murmured to her dogs, curiosity overriding her better judgment. "Let's see what's happening." They made their way through the crowd, Helen keeping both dogs close as the festival atmosphere shifted from celebration to concerned murmuring. She couldn't see much over the heads of taller onlookers, but she could hear Arthur's voice, pitched higher than usual with what sounded like genuine anger rather than his typical grumbling. "This is harassment," he was saying. "I don't care what you think you're owed. You can't just—" His words were cut off by a response Helen couldn't quite make out, though the tone was clearly heated. Mike pushed through the crowd with polite authority, and whatever argument had been taking place seemed to deflate at his presence. The crowd began to disperse as Mike handled whatever the situation had been, people drifting back toward the festival booths with the slightly disappointed air of those who'd hoped for more dramatic entertainment. Helen lingered for a moment, trying to catch a glimpse of who had been arguing with Arthur, but the angle was wrong, and there were still too many people in the way. "Nothing to see here, folks," Mike called out in his practiced crowd dispersal voice. "Just a misunderstanding. Everyone back to the festival." Helen took the hint and headed home with her dogs, but the peaceful morning had left her with an unsettled feeling she couldn't quite name. Maplewood was usually such a quiet place, where the biggest drama was typically about the annual Christmas decorating competition or debates over the library's book selection policy. As they walked down Elm Street toward her cozy blue cottage, Halo trotting contentedly beside her and Shadow maintaining his dignified pace, Helen tried to shake off her sense of unease. Tomorrow would be Sunday, quiet and normal, with nothing more exciting than her weekly batch of cinnamon rolls and a long walk with the dogs. She had no way of knowing that tomorrow morning would bring a discovery that would turn Maplewood's quiet normalcy upside down, or that her two beloved labs would play a crucial role in uncovering secrets that had been festering beneath the town's peaceful surface for months. The afternoon sun slanted through the maple trees as they reached home, painting everything in shades of gold and amber that made even Helen's modest cottage look like something from a fairy tale. She let the dogs into the backyard and settled on her porch swing with a cup of tea, watching them explore their familiar territory with the dedication of professional investigators. Everything seemed perfectly normal, perfectly peaceful, perfectly safe. By tomorrow evening, she would look back on this moment and remember it as the last time Maplewood felt like the simple, uncomplicated place she'd always believed it to be. Chapter 2. A Grim Discovery. Sunday morning dawned crisp and clear, with the kind of October sunshine that made everything look like a postcard. Helen had fallen into a comfortable retirement routine. Coffee and toast at 7, a scan of the newspaper's local section, and then the morning walk that had become the highlight of both her day and her dogs' lives. Halo was already dancing with excitement by the time Helen reached for the leashes, his entire body wiggling with the joy of someone who approached each walk as if it were his first. Shadow waited patiently by the door, but his tail betrayed his own enthusiasm with steady, measured wags. "All right, boys, let's see what adventures await us today," Helen said, clipping on their leashes. She'd learned to keep Halo on a shorter lead after yesterday's pie incident, though she suspected his next great escape was only a matter of time. They set out down Elm Street, taking their usual route that would wind through the quiet residential area, past the town square, and around the block that housed most of Maplewood's small business district. Sunday mornings were Helen's favorite time to walk. The streets were peaceful, the air was fresh, and she could let her mind wander without the distractions of weekday traffic or Saturday's family activities. The festival cleanup had been efficient, she noticed, as they passed the town square. The only evidence of yesterday's celebration was some lingering confetti caught in the gazebo railings, and a few forgotten ribbons tied to the maple trees. Maplewood took pride in leaving no trace after community events, a philosophy that extended to most aspects of small-town life. Halo seemed particularly interested in the scents around the square, pulling toward spots where food booths had been set up. Helen indulged his curiosity, knowing that his nose was processing a complex story of yesterday's festivities that she could barely imagine. Shadow, meanwhile, maintained his usual dignified pace, but kept his ears perked, alert to every sound in their quiet environment. They were turning onto Commerce Street, the narrow lane that ran behind the main business district, when Halo suddenly stopped dead in his tracks. His entire body went rigid, and his tail dropped to half-mast in a way that Helen had learned to recognize as his "something's not right" signal. "What is it, boy?" she asked, looking around the empty street. Nothing seemed out of place. The back entrances to the various shops looked the same as always, neat, utilitarian, with the small touches that reflected each owner's personality. Mrs. Chen's herb garden behind the Chinese restaurant, the colorful mural that decorated the back of the children's bookstore, the tidy stack of recyclables behind the hardware store, But Halo was not convinced that everything was normal. He began pulling toward the narrow alley that ran behind Arthur Greaves's antique shop, his usual bouncy enthusiasm replaced by something more focused and determined. Shadow, catching whatever scent or instinct had captured his brother's attention, moved to Helen's other side with the controlled alertness of a guard dog. "I don't think we need to go back there," Helen said, though her own curiosity was beginning to stir. The dogs were rarely wrong about these things, and their behavior was unusual enough to warrant attention. Halo whined softly, a sound he rarely made, and looked up at her with an expression that seemed to communicate urgent concern. Against her better judgment, Helen allowed him to lead her toward the alley, though she kept both leashes short and her senses alert. The alley behind Arthur's shop was narrow and shadowed, lined with the kind of utilitarian necessities that most business owners preferred to keep out of sight: dumpsters, storage boxes, and the cluttered accumulation of things that were too useful to throw away, but too ugly to keep in front. Helen had been back here only once before, delivering a special order birthday cake to Arthur's neighbor. She saw the shoes first, brown leather Oxfords, expensive-looking and well-maintained, extending from behind the green dumpster that served Arthur's shop and the neighboring florist. The angle was wrong, too flat, as if the person wearing them had simply lain down for a nap in the most uncomfortable place imaginable. Helen's heart began to pound as her mind processed what her eyes were seeing. She took a step closer, though every instinct screamed at her to turn around and walk away. Halo whined again, more urgently, and Shadow pressed against her leg in a way that felt protective. Arthur Greaves sat slumped against the brick wall behind his shop, his gray head tilted at an unnatural angle and his usually sharp eyes staring sightlessly at nothing. A dark stain spread across the front of his light blue shirt, centered on his chest in a way that left no doubt about what had happened. Helen's breath caught in her throat. In 62 years of life, including 30 years of dealing with every kind of customer emergency and personal crisis that small-town business ownership could produce, she had never seen anything like this. The reality of violent death was shockingly different from the sanitized versions she'd encountered in books and television. "Oh, Arthur," she whispered, though she knew he was far beyond hearing. Her first instinct was to rush forward, to check for signs of life, even though her eyes told her the truth. Her second instinct, fortunately stronger, was to back away and call for help. But as she fumbled for her cell phone with shaking hands, Halo pulled forward again, his nose working overtime on the scents around the scene. "No, Halo, leave it!" Her voice came out sharper than she'd intended, born of shock and the sudden understanding that this was now a crime scene, not just a tragic discovery. But her sharp tone had the opposite effect she'd hoped for. Instead of backing away, Halo became more insistent, pulling toward something specific that had caught his attention. Following his gaze, Helen noticed details that her initial shock had caused her to miss. A single feather, gray and white striped, rested on Arthur's jacket lapel, the kind of feather that could have come from any number of birds, but which looked oddly out of place in the urban alley setting. Near Arthur's left hand, partially hidden beneath a piece of newspaper that had blown against the wall, was what looked like a torn piece of paper. Helen couldn't make out what it was from her distance, but something about its bright colors suggested it wasn't random litter. Shadow, meanwhile, had positioned himself at the mouth of the alley, looking back toward the street with the alert posture of a dog on guard duty. His behavior reminded Helen that she was alone in a place where someone had recently committed murder, and that the perpetrator might still be nearby. She dialed 911 with fingers that trembled despite her efforts to stay calm. 911, what's your emergency? This is Helen Morrison. I'm behind the antique shop on Commerce Street, and I think Arthur Greaves has been shot. Ma'am, are you safe? Are you injured? I'm fine, but Helen looked at Arthur's still form and felt her voice catch. He's dead. Someone shot him. We're dispatching units now. Stay on the line and move to a safe location if possible. Can you see anyone else in the area? Helen looked around the empty alley, then back toward the street where Sunday morning Maplewood continued its peaceful routine, unaware that their world had just shifted on its axis. No, there's no one here. Just me and my dogs. Dogs? My labs. They're the ones who found him, actually. They knew something was wrong. The 911 operator kept her talking while she waited for the police, asking questions about her location, her safety, and what she'd observed. Helen found herself studying the scene with the detailed attention she'd once applied to troubleshooting failed recipes, noting things that might be important without understanding why. The dark stain on Arthur's shirt was centered and round, suggesting he'd been shot from close range while facing his attacker. There was no sign of a struggle, no overturned trash cans or scattered debris that would indicate he'd tried to fight or run. The expression on his face was one of surprise rather than fear, as if death had come too quickly for terror. Most significantly, there was no weapon visible anywhere in the alley. Helen might not be an expert on crime scenes, but she'd read enough mysteries to know that the absence of a gun meant this wasn't suicide. Someone had shot Arthur Greaves and then taken the weapon with them. The first patrol car arrived within minutes, followed quickly by Sheriff Brady and what appeared to be half the emergency services in the county. Helen found herself moved to the street, where she gave her statement to a young deputy while Mike Brady took charge of the crime scene with the grim efficiency of someone who'd hoped never to deal with this kind of situation in Maplewood. "Tell me exactly what happened, Mrs. Morrison," the deputy said, his notebook ready and his expression professionally sympathetic. Helen recounted the morning walk, Halo's unusual behavior, and her discovery of Arthur's body. As she spoke, she became aware of the growing crowd of neighbors and business owners who were arriving to start their Sunday routines, only to find their quiet street transformed into a crime scene. "Did you touch anything? Move anything?" the deputy asked. "No, nothing." "The dogs wanted to get closer, but I kept them back once I realized what I was looking at." "Good thinking. And you didn't see anyone else in the area? No vehicles leaving? No one walking away?" Helen shook her head. "Commerce Street was empty when we got there, but—" She hesitated, remembering the feather and the torn paper she'd noticed. "But what, ma'am?" "There were some things near the body that seemed odd. A feather on his jacket, and what looked like a piece of torn paper or cardboard near his hand. I didn't get close enough to see clearly." The deputy made notes, then looked down at Halo and Shadow, who were sitting politely at Helen's feet despite the chaos around them. "These are the dogs that found him?" "Yes." Halo especially seemed to know something was wrong. He's usually distracted by everything, but today he was focused on that alley in a way I've never seen before. As if hearing his name, Halo looked up at Helen with bright, attentive eyes. Despite the morning's trauma, his tail gave a small wag, and Helen found herself oddly comforted by his resilience. Shadow, meanwhile, continued his vigilant watch of their surroundings, as if he understood that their peaceful world had become a more dangerous place. Sheriff Brady approached, looking older than his 50-something years and wearing the expression of someone dealing with his first murder investigation. "Helen, I'm sorry you had to be the one to find him. Are you all right?" "I'm fine, Mike, just shaken. Have you been able to determine what happened?" "Early stages yet, but it looks like he was shot sometime last night. The coroner will have to determine the exact time." He paused, studying her face. "I hate to ask, but did you notice anything unusual at the festival yesterday? Any arguments or conflicts involving Arthur?" Helen thought back to the previous day, remembering the incident at the pie table and the later commotion near Arthur's shop. "He had words with me about Halo's accident with the pies, but that was minor. There was some kind of argument near his shop later in the afternoon, but I couldn't see who was involved. We'll need to talk to everyone who had contact with him yesterday." Mike's expression was grave. "This is going to shake up the whole town." As if to underscore his point, Helen noticed familiar faces in the growing crowd of onlookers. June Butterworth stood near the corner, her usual birding binoculars around her neck and her expression unreadable. Ricky Doyle's food truck was parked across the street, though he wasn't serving customers. Instead, he stood beside the vehicle, arms crossed and face serious as he watched the police activity. Most surprising was Tabitha Lane, elegantly dressed even for a Sunday morning emergency, standing with the composed poise that Helen had always admired. But today there was something different about her expression, a carefully controlled intensity that seemed at odds with the genuine shock and concern shown by other community members. "I should get the boys home," Helen said, suddenly feeling overwhelmed by the morning's events. "They've had enough excitement for one day." "Of course. We'll need a formal statement later, but that can wait until this afternoon." Mike's expression softened. "And Helen?" "Thank you for calling it in properly. A lot of people would have panicked or contaminated the scene." As Helen walked home with her dogs, the weight of the morning's discovery settled over her like a heavy blanket. Arthur Greaves hadn't been a particularly likable man, but he'd been part of Maplewood's fabric for 20 years. His sudden, violent death felt like a tear in the comfortable reality she'd built around her retirement. More troubling was the growing certainty that Arthur's murder wasn't the result of a random crime or outside threat. The location, the lack of robbery, and the personal nature of a close-range shooting all suggested that his killer was someone he knew, someone from their own small community. As they reached her cottage, Helen looked back toward Commerce Street, where the police cars and emergency vehicles were still clustered around the alley behind the antique shop. Somewhere in Maplewood, Arthur's killer was probably going about their Sunday routine, perhaps even joining the crowds of concerned neighbors who had gathered to watch the investigation. The thought made her lock her front door for the first time in years, and gave both dogs extra treats before settling into her kitchen with a cup of tea that did nothing to stop her hands from shaking. Outside her window, Maplewood looked exactly the same as it had every Sunday morning for the past 5 years. But Helen knew that nothing would ever be quite the same again. Someone in their peaceful little town was a murderer, and until that person was caught, every neighbor would be a potential suspect, and every familiar face would carry the shadow of doubt. Halo settled at her feet with a contented sigh, apparently unbothered by their dramatic mourning. Shadow, more sensitive to his human's emotional state, rested his head on her knee and looked up at her with dark eyes that seemed to understand everything. "What do you think, boys?" she murmured, scratching behind Shadow's ears. "Who would want to hurt Arthur?" Neither dog had answers, but as Helen sat in her quiet kitchen, she found her mind turning over the events of the past 24 hours with the methodical attention she'd once applied to perfecting difficult recipes. Arthur had made enemies yesterday. That much was clear. The question was, which of those enemies had decided that verbal conflict wasn't enough? Chapter 3. Questions and Neighbors. Helen spent the rest of Sunday trying to return to her normal routine, but normalcy felt elusive with police cars still visible from her front window and the knowledge that Arthur's body had been removed from the alley behind his shop just hours ago. She baked a batch of apple cinnamon muffins, more for the comfort of familiar activity than from any real appetite, and found herself staring out the kitchen window every few minutes as if expecting to see something that would make sense of the morning's horror. Halo and Shadow seemed to sense her distress. Halo, usually a whirlwind of energy that required constant entertainment, spent most of the afternoon lying quietly at her feet. Shadow maintained his vigil by the front door, occasionally lifting his head to listen to sounds that Helen couldn't detect. By Monday morning, the news of Arthur's murder had spread through Maplewood with the efficiency that only small towns could achieve. Helen's phone rang 3 times before she'd finished her morning coffee, friends and neighbors calling with expressions of shock, requests for details, and the kind of morbid curiosity that violent death inspired even in the most well-meaning people. "I just can't believe it," said Betty Marsh from the hardware store. "Murder in Maplewood. It's like something from television." "Have they arrested anyone yet?" asked Tom Patterson, her next-door neighbor. "Should we be worried about our safety?" Helen found herself repeating the same basic facts. She'd found the body during her morning walk. Arthur appeared to have been shot. The police were investigating, while trying to avoid the more disturbing details that would fuel additional gossip and speculation. It was during her conversation with Martha Kowalski that Helen learned something that made her sit up straighter in her kitchen chair. "I heard from my cousin who works at the bank," Martha said in the conspiratorial tone reserved for especially significant gossip, "that Arthur was having serious financial troubles. Behind on his rent, credit cards maxed out, the whole 9 yards." Really? His shop always seemed to do steady business. Apparently not steady enough. And here's the interesting part. There was talk that he might have been selling fake antiques to people, passing them off as the real thing. Can you imagine? Helen could imagine, actually. Arthur's personality would have made it easy to rationalize deceiving customers, especially if he convinced himself they were too ignorant to know the difference. But financial desperation and questionable business practices added new layers to the question of who might have wanted him dead. After hanging up with Martha, Helen decided that sitting at home speculating wasn't helping anyone, least of all herself. She leashed the dogs and set out for a walk that would, coincidentally, take her past several places where she might learn more about Arthur's final day. Her first stop was the town square, where the festival cleanup had left everything looking pristine and normal. But as she stood near the gazebo where she'd watched yesterday's events unfold, Helen found herself remembering the tensions she'd observed among Arthur's neighbors and fellow business owners. "Terrible thing, isn't it?" said a voice behind her. Helen turned to find June Butterworth approaching, looking more disheveled than usual. June's gray hair was escaping from its ponytail, and her clothes had the rumpled appearance of someone who'd slept poorly. "Yes, it is. I still can't quite believe it happened." June settled onto the bench beside Helen, pulling her ever-present binoculars into her lap. Arthur wasn't well liked, but murder, that's something else entirely. There was something in June's tone that made Helen study her more carefully. The older woman's hands were shaking slightly, and her usual enthusiastic demeanor seemed forced. "Did you know him well?" Helen asked gently. "Well enough." June's voice carried a bitter edge. "Well enough to know he was a cheat and a liar." The words hung in the air between them, more vehement than Helen had expected. She waited, sensing that June had more to say. "He sold me a bird guide last month," June continued, her voice growing stronger with anger. "Claimed it was a first-edition Audubon worth thousands. I saved for months to buy it, thought it would be the crown jewel of my collection. And it wasn't authentic? Complete fake. Good enough to fool most people, but I've been studying birds for 40 years. I know the real thing when I see it." June's hands clenched around her binoculars. "When I confronted him, he claimed I was mistaken. Said the sale was final, and he wouldn't take it back." Helen remembered Martha's gossip about Arthur selling fake antiques, and June's story seemed to confirm the rumors. "Did you report it to anyone?" "Who would I report it to?" Arthur was considered an expert by most people in town. It would have been my word against his, and he had the reputation. June laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Had the reputation? Past tense now, I suppose?" The bitter satisfaction in June's voice made Helen uncomfortable. She could understand anger over being cheated, but there was something disturbing about the way June seemed to take pleasure in Arthur's death. "That must have been very frustrating," Helen said carefully. "How much money did you lose?" $3,000. My entire bird-watching vacation fund. Gone." June's voice cracked slightly, revealing genuine pain beneath the anger. "I was planning to go to Costa Rica this winter, see the quetzals and toucans I've dreamed about for years. Instead, I have a worthless fake sitting on my shelf, mocking me every time I look at it." Helen felt a stab of sympathy. $3,000 was a significant sum for someone on a fixed income, and the loss of a long-planned dream trip would be devastating. But it also provided a compelling motive for murder, especially if June had confronted Arthur recently. "I'm so sorry, June. That's terrible." Helen paused, then asked gently, "Did you see Arthur at all on Saturday? After our conversation at the festival?" June's expression shifted, becoming guarded. "Why do you ask?" "I just wondered if he seemed different, worried or upset about anything." "He seemed like his usual arrogant self." June stood abruptly, adjusting her binoculars with nervous energy. "I should get going. The autumn migration is in full swing, and I have observations to record." As June walked away, Helen noticed that she headed not toward the wooded area where birdwatching would be productive, but toward the business district where Arthur's shop sat empty and cordoned off with police tape. The coincidence felt significant, though Helen wasn't sure why. Halo, who had been patiently watching a squirrel during Helen's conversation with June, suddenly perked up as a familiar sound reached their ears, the distinctive rumble of Ricky Doyle's food truck. Helen decided that lunch from the rolling kitchen would provide a perfect excuse to continue her informal investigation. She found Ricky parked in his usual spot near the post office, serving a modest lunch crowd with his trademark charm. But Helen noticed that his easy smile seemed strained today, and there were dark circles under his eyes that suggested he'd slept as poorly as everyone else in town. "Helen? The usual?" Ricky called out as she approached. "Though I have to warn you, my chili might be a little off today. Hard to concentrate on cooking after, well, you know." "I can imagine. It's been a shock for everyone." Helen ordered a bowl of chili and a cornbread muffin, more to support Ricky's business than because she felt hungry. As he prepared her order, she studied his movements, noting the slight tremor in his hands and the way he kept glancing toward the police tape visible around Arthur's shop. "You knew Arthur pretty well, didn't you?" she asked when Ricky handed her the steaming bowl. "As well as anyone, I suppose, which is to say, not very well at all." Ricky's laugh was forced. He wasn't exactly the neighborly type. "Martha mentioned he'd been having some business troubles lately." Ricky's expression darkened. Business troubles, personal troubles, you name it. The man was a walking disaster area. He paused, then seemed to catch himself. "I shouldn't speak ill of the dead, I suppose." "Did you have any dealings with him? Business-wise, I mean?" The question seemed to hit a nerve. Ricky's jaw tightened and he turned away to wipe down his prep counter with unnecessary vigor. "You could say that. Arthur had opinions about where food trucks should be allowed to operate." Helen waited, sensing there was more to the story. "He complained to the city council about my parking permit," Ricky continued, his voice tight with controlled anger. "Said food trucks were lowering the tone of the business district, driving away his antique customers. Complete nonsense, of course. My customers and his customers weren't exactly the same demographic." That must have been frustrating. "Frustrating doesn't begin to cover it. I invested everything I had in this truck, moved to Maplewood specifically because the city seemed welcoming to small food businesses. Then Arthur started his campaign to get me kicked out of downtown." Ricky's knuckles were white where he gripped the counter. "Do you know what it's like to have your entire livelihood threatened by one bitter old man who thinks he owns the whole street?" The vehemence in Ricky's voice was striking, and Helen found herself remembering the argument she'd witnessed near Arthur's shop during the festival. "Did you two have words on Saturday?" Ricky's eyes snapped to hers, sharp and suddenly wary. "What do you mean?" "I saw some kind of commotion near his shop during the festival. I thought you might have been involved." For a moment, Ricky said nothing, his face cycling through several expressions before settling on resigned admission. "Yeah, we had words. He cornered me after lunch service, started going on about how food trucks were ruining Maplewood's historic character. I told him exactly what I thought of his historic character. It looked pretty heated from where I was standing." "It was heated. Arthur had a way of bringing out the worst in people." Ricky's smile was bitter. "But I didn't kill him, if that's what you're getting at." Helen felt her cheeks flush. "I wasn't suggesting—" "Sure you were, and I don't blame you. Half the town probably had reasons to want Arthur gone." Ricky handed change to another customer, then turned back to Helen. But wanting someone gone and actually murdering them are two different things. As Helen walked away with her lunch, she couldn't shake the feeling that Ricky was hiding something. His story about the parking permit dispute rang true. It was exactly the kind of petty conflict that Arthur would have pursued with vindictive determination. But there had been something in Ricky's eyes when he denied killing Arthur, a flicker of something that looked almost like guilt. Her final stop was the most challenging one. Tabitha Lane lived in the restored Victorian mansion on Sycamore Street, the kind of elegant home that perfectly suited a former actress who valued style and presentation. Helen had never had reason to visit before, but today she felt compelled to see how Tabitha was handling the town's first murder. The house was everything Helen had expected: perfectly maintained, tastefully decorated, and slightly intimidating in its old-world elegance. Tabitha answered the door wearing a flowing silk blouse and carefully applied makeup, looking far too put together for someone who just learned that her neighbor had been murdered. "Helen, what a surprise. Please come in." Tabitha's voice carried the trained projection of someone accustomed to being heard in large theaters. The interior of the house was like stepping into a museum filled with antiques, artwork, and theatrical memorabilia that spoke of a life lived in more glamorous circumstances than small-town retirement usually offered. Helen noticed several pieces that looked expensive enough to represent significant investments. "I was just having tea. Would you like some?" Tabitha gestured toward an elaborate tea service set up in the front parlor. "That's very kind, thank you." As Tabitha prepared her tea with practiced elegance, Helen found herself studying the other woman with new attention. Tabitha had always been something of a mystery in Maplewood, friendly but reserved, elegant but not ostentatious, clearly well-educated but vague about her past beyond general references to theater work. "This business with Arthur is just terrible, isn't it?" Tabitha said, settling into her chair with fluid grace. "I can hardly believe something like this could happen in Maplewood." "Did you know him well?" "As well as anyone, I suppose. We had some business dealings over the years." Tabitha's tone was carefully neutral, but Helen caught a slight tightness around her eyes. "Business dealings?" "I'm something of a collector, as you can see." Tabitha gestured toward the artwork covering her walls. "Arthur occasionally had pieces that interested me." Helen studied the paintings more carefully, noting the quality and obvious age of several pieces. "You have beautiful taste. These must be quite valuable." "Some more than others. I've been collecting for years, though I'm afraid my budget has become more limited since retiring from the theater." Tabitha smiled, but there was something forced about it. One learns to be selective. Something about the conversation felt carefully scripted, as if Tabitha were playing a role rather than having a genuine discussion. Helen decided to be more direct. "I heard that Arthur might have been having financial troubles. Did that affect your business relationship with him?" The question hit its target. Tabitha's composed expression faltered for just a moment, revealing something that looked like anger before the mask slipped back into place. "Arthur was not always completely honest in his business practices," Tabitha said carefully. "I learned to be cautious in my dealings with him." "Cautious how?" Tabitha stood and walked to the fireplace, where Helen noticed a small pile of ash that looked recent despite the mild weather. "I required authentication for any significant purchases. Arthur found that insulting." "Did you buy something from him recently?" "I was considering a purchase. A small painting that he claimed was by a regional artist from the 1920s. Quite lovely and reasonably priced for an authenticated piece." Tabitha's voice hardened. "Unfortunately, when I had it examined by an expert, it proved to be a modern reproduction." Helen felt the pieces clicking together. "He tried to sell you a fake." "He tried to defraud me of $5,000. The elegant facade cracked, revealing genuine fury. "When I confronted him with the authentication report, he claimed the expert was wrong and refused to refund my deposit." "Your deposit?" $2,000, which he claimed was non-refundable once I took possession of the piece. Tabitha's hands clenched at her sides. "Legally, I had little recourse. Arthur was careful to structure his sales in ways that protected him from fraud claims." Helen thought about June's similar story and felt a chill of understanding. Arthur hadn't just been unpleasant. He'd been systematically cheating people, targeting those who were most vulnerable to his particular brand of expertise-based fraud. "That must have been very upsetting," Helen said gently. "Upsetting doesn't begin to describe it. $2,000 represents months of careful budgeting for me. But more than the money—" Tabitha paused, her composure slipping further. "More than the money was the humiliation. Arthur treated me like some naive old woman who could be easily fooled. He actually laughed when I threatened to expose his practices." The image of Arthur laughing at Tabitha's threats made Helen's stomach turn. She could imagine how that would have felt to someone who had spent decades commanding respect on stage, only to be dismissed and cheated by a small-town antique dealer. "Did you see Arthur at all on Saturday, after the festival?" Tabitha's eyes sharpened, and Helen had the distinct impression of being evaluated by someone with considerable intelligence and experience reading people. "Why do you ask?" "I'm just trying to understand his last day, whether he seemed worried or upset about anything." Arthur never seemed worried about anything. He was far too arrogant for self-doubt. Tabitha returned to her chair, her movements controlled but tense. "Though, now that you mention it, he did seem different at the festival, more agitated than usual." "Different how?" "He was arguing with several people, which wasn't unusual, but there was something almost frantic about it, as if he were trying to defend himself rather than simply being disagreeable for its own sake." Helen thought about the various conflicts she'd witnessed or heard about during the festival. Arthur arguing with June about the fake bird guide, confronting Ricky about the food truck permit, and whatever business he'd had with Tabitha regarding the fraudulent painting. Any one of those disputes could have escalated beyond words. "I should let you get back to your day," Helen said, standing to leave. "Thank you for the tea." "Of course. And Helen?" Tabitha's voice stopped her at the door. "Be careful with your questions. If someone killed Arthur, they might not appreciate having their business examined too closely." The warning sent a chill down Helen's spine as she walked home with the dogs. She'd approached her informal investigation as if it were an intellectual puzzle, something to satisfy her curiosity about the dramatic events that had disrupted Maplewood's peace. But Tabitha's words reminded her that Arthur's killer was real, probably local, and potentially dangerous to anyone who got too close to the truth. As they reached her cottage, Helen looked back toward the center of town, where 3 people she'd just spoken with were going about their afternoon routines. June Butterworth, cheated out of $3,000 and her dream vacation. Ricky Doyle, facing the potential loss of his livelihood and business investment. Tabitha Lane, humiliated and defrauded by someone who had laughed at her threats. Any one of them had sufficient motive to want Arthur dead. The question was which one had decided that murder was the solution to their problem. Helen unlocked her front door and let the dogs into the backyard, then settled at her kitchen table with a cup of coffee and a notebook. If she was going to continue investigating Arthur's murder, and despite Tabitha's warning, she found that she needed to approach it with the same methodical attention she'd once applied to perfecting complex recipes. At the top of a fresh page, she wrote, "Motives, opportunities, and means." Then she began listing everything she'd learned about Arthur's final conflicts and the people who had reasons to want him dead. Outside her window, Maplewood looked as peaceful as ever, but Helen now knew that beneath the surface of their quiet community, anger and desperation had been building to a deadly conclusion. And somewhere among her fellow residents walked a killer who thought they'd gotten away with murder. Chapter 4, Digging Deeper. Tuesday morning brought the kind of gray, drizzly weather that seemed to match Maplewood's subdued mood. Helen had spent a restless night thinking about her conversations with June, Ricky, and Tabitha, and she woke with the unsettled feeling that she'd learned important information without understanding what it all meant. Over breakfast, she reviewed the notes she'd made the previous evening, studying the 3 clear motives for Arthur's murder. But motive alone didn't make someone a killer, and Helen found herself wondering about the practical aspects of the crime itself. Arthur had been shot at close range, which suggested he'd known his attacker and hadn't been afraid of them, at least not initially. The murder had taken place in the alley behind his shop, a location that offered privacy, but also required knowledge of Arthur's habits and movements. Most significantly, the killer had taken the weapon with them, indicating premeditation rather than a crime of passion. As she sipped her coffee and watched Halo and Shadow explore the rain-dampened backyard, Helen realized she needed to know more about Arthur's final day. Who had he seen after the festival ended? What had brought him to the alley behind his shop on Saturday evening? Her phone rang just as she was finishing breakfast, and Sheriff Brady's voice carried a tone of professional courtesy that hadn't been there during their more casual interactions. "Helen, I hope you don't mind me calling. I have a few follow-up questions about Saturday morning." "Of course, Mike. Anything I can do to help?" "Could you come down to the station this afternoon? I'd like to go over your statement in more detail, and I want to show you some evidence we collected from the scene." The formal request sent a flutter of nervousness through Helen's stomach. Am I in some kind of trouble? Not at all. You were very helpful, and your dogs may have actually preserved important evidence by keeping you from contaminating the scene. I just want to make sure we haven't missed anything. After hanging up, Helen found herself looking forward to the appointment with a mixture of anxiety and curiosity. She'd been operating on secondhand information and her own observations, but Mike might be able to fill in some of the gaps in her understanding of the crime. She decided to spend the morning doing something constructive, so she baked 24 chocolate chip cookies with the intention of taking them to the police station. It was a small gesture, but one that fit with her role as a concerned community member rather than someone conducting her own investigation. The walk to the police station took her past Arthur's antique shop, which remained cordoned off with yellow tape and looked oddly abandoned in the gray morning light. Helen paused, studying the building with new eyes, trying to imagine the sequence of events that had led to Arthur's death in the alley behind it. The shop occupied the ground floor of a 2-story brick building that dated back to the 1920s. Arthur had lived in the apartment above the shop, which explained why he might have been in the alley late on a Saturday evening. It was essentially his backyard. But it didn't explain who he'd been meeting, or why he'd felt safe enough to face his killer without apparent fear. Terrible thing, isn't it? Helen turned to find Deputy Collins, the young officer who'd taken her statement on Sunday morning. He looked tired, as if the investigation was weighing on the entire police department. "Yes, it is." "Any progress with the case?" "Sheriff Brady will have to fill you in on the details, but I can tell you we're following several promising leads." Collins glanced at the empty shop. Hard to believe something like this could happen here. Did Arthur have any family? Anyone to handle his affairs? "A nephew in Chicago, but they weren't close. Poor guy is driving down today to deal with the arrangements." Collins shook his head. 30 years in this town, and Arthur managed to die without a single person who really cared about him. That's pretty sad when you think about it. The observation stayed with Helen as she continued to the police station. Arthur's personality had isolated him from the community he'd lived in for 3 decades, but that isolation had also made him vulnerable to someone who felt wronged enough to commit murder. Without friends to watch out for him or family to check on his welfare, Arthur had been an easy target for anyone planning violence. The Maplewood Police Department occupied a modest building that reflected the town's traditionally low crime rate. Helen had been inside only once before, to register her dogs after moving to town, and she was struck by how different it felt now that it was the center of a murder investigation. Sheriff Brady met her in the lobby, looking more serious than she'd ever seen him. "Helen, thanks for coming in. I know this isn't easy, but your observations could be crucial to solving this case." He led her to a small conference room where evidence photos were spread across the table in careful organization. Helen felt her stomach clench as she recognized the scene she'd discovered Sunday morning, now documented in clinical detail that somehow made it more real and more horrible than her memory. "I want you to look at these photos and tell me if you notice anything different from what you remember seeing," Mike said gently. "Sometimes witnesses recall details that become important later." Helen studied the images, forcing herself to focus on the investigative aspects rather than the disturbing reality of Arthur's death. The photos showed the scene from multiple angles, capturing details that her shocked observation had missed. "The feather," she said, pointing to one image. "It was on his jacket lapel, just like that. It seemed odd because there aren't many birds that would be in that alley." "Good eye. We had it analyzed, and it came from a domesticated parrot. Not exactly common in Maplewood." Helen thought immediately of June Butterworth's exotic parrot, the one that could mimic voices. "June Butterworth has a parrot, a large one that talks?" Mike made a note. "We'll need to speak with her about that. What else do you notice? Helen continued studying the photos, paying particular attention to the torn piece of paper she'd observed near Arthur's hand. In the clear image, she could see it was actually a ticket stub, colorful and partially legible. That paper, it's a theater ticket, isn't it? Very good. It's from a production that ran at the Riverside Theater about 10 years ago. The Glass Menagerie. Helen's pulse quickened. Tabitha Lane had been a professional actress before retiring to Maplewood, and she'd mentioned her theater background during their conversation. The coincidence seemed too significant to ignore. There's something else, Mike continued, pulling out a plastic evidence bag. We found this in the victim's jacket pocket. Helen leaned forward to examine a small piece of paper with writing she couldn't quite make out through the plastic. What does it say? It's a note. Meet me behind the shop at 9 p.m. We need to settle this. No signature, but it's written on paper from a restaurant order pad. The implication hit Helen immediately. Ricky Doyle uses order pads for his food truck. That's what we thought. We're having the handwriting analyzed, but the note suggests Arthur was lured to the alley by someone he knew. Helen felt pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. The 3 people she'd identified as having motives for Arthur's murder were now connected to physical evidence found at the scene. June's parrot feather, Tabitha's theater background, and Ricky's restaurant supplies all placed them, circumstantially at least, at the scene of the crime. There's one more thing I wanted to show you, Mike said, pulling out his phone. We recovered a voicemail from Arthur's answering machine. The message was left Saturday evening, about 2 hours before we estimate he was killed. He played the recording, and Helen heard a woman's voice, distorted by what sounded like electronic interference or poor phone quality. Arthur, you can't keep doing this to people. It ends tonight. The voice was impossible to identify clearly, but there was something familiar about the cadence that made Helen think she'd heard it before. The problem was that it could have been any of the 3 women she'd spoken to, or someone else entirely. Do you recognize the voice? Mike asked. It sounds familiar, but I can't place it. The quality makes it hard to tell. We're having it analyzed by a specialist, but these things take time. Mike gathered the photos back into their folder. Helen, I need to ask you something directly. Have you been conducting your own investigation into this case? The question caught Helen off guard, and she felt her cheeks warm with embarrassment. I wouldn't call it an investigation. I've just been talking to neighbors, trying to understand what happened. I understand the impulse, but I need you to be careful. If someone killed Arthur over a personal dispute, they might not appreciate having their business examined too closely. It was almost exactly what Tabitha had said, and the repetition of the warning made Helen realize how exposed her amateur detective work had made her. Do you think I'm in danger? I think Arthur's killer is probably someone he knew, someone who had a specific grievance against him. But desperate people sometimes make poor decisions, and I don't want you to become a target. As Helen walked home with her dogs, she found herself looking at familiar faces with new suspicion. Any of her neighbors could be Arthur's killer, hiding behind the mask of normal daily routine while planning their next move. The thought made her quicken her pace and look forward to the security of her locked front door. But even as she acknowledged the risk, Helen knew she couldn't simply stop investigating. The evidence Mike had shown her raised as many questions as it answered, and she had access to information and observations that the police might not. She just needed to be more careful about how she pursued her inquiries. That afternoon, she decided to visit Martha Kowalski under the pretense of discussing festival cleanup activities. Martha was involved in every community organization and usually knew more about local gossip than anyone else in town. She found Martha in her garden, pulling up the last of her summer vegetables with the methodical efficiency of someone who'd been gardening for decades. Martha's face lit up when she saw Helen approaching with the dogs. Helen, how are you holding up, dear? This whole business with Arthur must have been traumatic for you. I'm managing, though I can't stop thinking about it. Have you heard anything about the investigation? Martha glanced around conspiratorially, then gestured for Helen to sit on her garden bench. Well, I don't like to spread rumors, but my neighbor's daughter works at the bank, and she said the police have been asking questions about Arthur's financial situation. What kind of questions? About his business accounts, his debts, that sort of thing. Apparently, Arthur was in much worse financial shape than anyone realized. Behind on his rent, maxed out credit cards, and rumors that he owed money to some unsavory people. This was new information that added another dimension to Arthur's murder. If he'd been involved with loan sharks or other dangerous creditors, his death might not have been connected to his local disputes at all. Unsavory people? That's what I heard, though you know how rumors can get exaggerated. Still, it makes you wonder if Arthur's killer was someone from outside Maplewood. Helen considered this possibility, but it didn't align with the personal nature of the evidence she'd seen. The theater ticket, the parrot feather, and the note all suggested local connections, rather than professional criminals. I also heard, Martha continued, lowering her voice further, that Arthur had been asking around town about getting a gun. A gun? When? Just last week, according to Tom Henderson. Arthur stopped by the hardware store asking about gun shops and concealed carry permits. Said he was worried about break-ins at the shop. The information sent a chill through Helen. If Arthur had been afraid enough to consider arming himself, it suggested he knew he was in danger. But it also raised the disturbing possibility that his killer had known about his plans and acted before Arthur could protect himself. Did he actually buy a gun? Tom didn't think so. You know how complicated the paperwork is these days, and Arthur wanted something immediately. Tom told him he'd have to wait for background checks and cooling-off periods. As Helen walked home, she tried to fit this new information into her understanding of the case. Arthur's financial troubles provided additional motives for murder, but they also suggested desperation that might have made him more dangerous to his enemies. If June, Ricky, or Tabitha had known he was considering arming himself, they might have felt pressured to act quickly. The rain had stopped, and the late afternoon sun was beginning to break through the clouds, casting long shadows across the quiet residential streets. Helen found the changing weather oddly hopeful, as if nature were reminding her that even the darkest situations eventually gave way to something brighter. But as she unlocked her front door and let the dogs into the house, Helen couldn't shake the feeling that Arthur's murder was far from solved. The evidence pointed in multiple directions. Each of her 3 suspects had both motive and possible connections to the crime scene, and new information kept emerging that complicated rather than clarified the picture. Someone in Maplewood had committed murder and was now living with that secret, probably watching the investigation with growing anxiety. Helen just hoped that person's desperation wouldn't lead to more violence before the truth finally came to light. That evening, she sat at her kitchen table with her notebook, adding the new information about Arthur's financial troubles and his interest in buying a gun. The picture that emerged was of a man who had made enemies through his business practices and personal behavior, then found himself facing consequences he was desperate to avoid. But desperation could be dangerous, especially when it led to murder. And Helen was beginning to realize that her own investigation might be putting her in the same kind of danger that had ultimately killed Arthur Greaves. Chapter 5. Secrets Unveiled. Wednesday morning brought crisp autumn sunshine and the first real cold snap of the season. Helen woke to find frost coating her garden and both dogs curled up in their beds rather than sprawled across the cool kitchen tiles. The change in weather seemed to herald a change in the investigation as well, as if the clarity of the cold air might finally bring clarity to Arthur's murder. She was letting the dogs out for their morning routine when her phone rang. Sheriff Brady's voice carried an urgency she hadn't heard before. "Helen, I need to ask you something important. Yesterday you mentioned that June Butterworth has a parrot. Can you describe it?" "It's a large bird, African gray, I think. Very talkative." Helen felt her pulse quicken. "Why?" "We had the feather analyzed more thoroughly. It's definitely from an African gray parrot. And there's something else. The voicemail on Arthur's answering machine. Our audio specialist thinks it might not be a human voice at all." The implication hit Helen like a physical blow. "You think the parrot left the message?" "It's possible. African greys are excellent mimics, and if the bird had heard someone making threats against Arthur, it could have repeated them exactly." Mike's voice was grim. "We need to speak with June Butterworth immediately. Do you know where she might be this morning? Helen thought about June's birding habits. She usually does her morning observations in Riverside Park, near the pond. She likes to document the waterfowl migration patterns. Thanks. And Helen? If you see June before we do, don't approach her alone. We're treating her as our primary suspect now. After hanging up, Helen found herself staring out at her backyard, where Halo was investigating the frost-covered grass with scientific dedication, while Shadow maintained his usual dignified patrol of the fence line. The idea that June Butterworth, eccentric, bird-loving June, might be a murderer seemed almost absurd. But Helen had to admit that the evidence was compelling. She was still processing this development when she noticed a figure walking past her house with the purposeful stride of someone on a mission. It was Tabitha Lane, dressed in an elegant gray coat and carrying what looked like a small overnight bag. Curiosity overrode caution, and Helen quickly leashed the dogs and followed at a discreet distance. Tabitha's route took her toward the business district, but instead of heading to the main street, she turned down the alley that ran behind the shops, the same alley where Arthur had been murdered. Helen's heart began to race as she realized what Tabitha might be doing. If there was evidence hidden at the crime scene, evidence that could incriminate her in Arthur's murder, she might be planning to retrieve it before the police found it. Keeping to shadows and using parked cars for cover, Helen followed Tabitha to the mouth of the alley. She could see the older woman moving purposefully toward the area behind Arthur's shop, which was still marked with police tape, but no longer actively guarded. Helen was debating whether to call Sheriff Brady when she heard voices from deeper in the alley. Tabitha wasn't alone. Someone else was back there with her. Helen strained to listen, but the words were indistinct, though the tone suggested argument or confrontation. She was trying to get closer when Halo, apparently deciding that subtlety was overrated, barked loudly at something that had caught his attention. The sound echoed off the brick walls like a gunshot, and Helen heard the voices in the alley fall silent. "Who's there?" called Tabitha's voice, sharp with alarm. Helen realized she had two choices: retreat and possibly miss crucial evidence, or reveal herself and hope that her presence would prevent whatever confrontation was taking place from escalating to violence. The decision was made for her when Shadow, apparently sensing her tension, began pulling toward the alley with the determination of a dog who knew something was wrong. "It's Helen Morrison," she called out, allowing the dogs to lead her into the alley. "I was just walking by and heard voices." She found Tabitha standing near the spot where Arthur's body had been discovered, facing Ricky Doyle with an expression of barely controlled anger. Both of them looked startled and guilty, like children caught in mischief rather than adults discussing legitimate business. "Helen," Tabitha said, her composure slipping back into place with visible effort. "What an unexpected surprise." Ricky looked considerably less composed. His face was flushed, and there were beads of sweat on his forehead despite the cold morning air. I was just checking to see if the police had finished with the crime scene." It was obviously a lie, and Helen decided that direct confrontation might be her best strategy. "Actually, I think you were both here looking for something. Something you were afraid the police might find." The accusation hung in the air between them, and Helen saw Tabitha and Ricky exchange a look that spoke of shared secrets and mutual concern. "I don't know what you're talking about," Tabitha said, but her voice lacked conviction. "I think you do. I think you're both involved in Arthur's murder, and you came here to clean up evidence you missed the first time." Ricky laughed, but it sounded forced and nervous. "That's crazy, Helen. Why would we kill Arthur?" "Because he was blackmailing you." The words came out of Helen's mouth before she'd fully formed the thought, but as soon as she spoke them, she knew they were true. The financial troubles, the desperate attempts to maintain facades, the shared look of guilt. It all pointed to something more complex than simple disputes over fake antiques and parking permits. "Blackmailing us?" Tabitha's voice was steady, but her knuckles were white where she gripped her purse. Arthur was in financial trouble, but he was also greedy and vindictive. If he discovered something about either of you that you wanted kept secret, he would have used it. Helen felt the pieces clicking into place with terrible clarity. What did he know about you, Tabitha? What secret was worth paying blackmail to protect? For a moment, she thought Tabitha would maintain her denial. Then something in the older woman's posture crumbled, and she seemed to age 10 years in as many seconds. He knew about Chicago, Tabitha said quietly. Chicago? I wasn't just an actress. I was involved in some financial irregularities with a theater company there. Nothing violent, just creative accounting that helped us stay afloat during a difficult season. Tabitha's voice was barely above a whisper. But it was embezzlement, technically. I could never go back to Chicago, never use my real name in professional theater again. Helen turned to Ricky, who was staring at the ground with the defeated expression of someone whose deepest secrets had been exposed. And you? Food poisoning incident in Detroit, he said without looking up. 30 people hospitalized because I cut corners on food safety. Lost my restaurant, lost everything. Ricky Doyle isn't even my real name. The confessions hung in the cold air like visible breath, and Helen felt a mixture of sympathy and horror. Both Tabitha and Ricky had been running from their pasts, trying to build new lives in Maplewood's forgiving anonymity. Arthur had discovered their secrets and used them for profit. How much was he asking for? Helen asked gently. $1,000 a month from each of us, Ricky said. Money I didn't have, especially with him trying to get my food truck permit revoked at the same time. He was systematically destroying our lives, Tabitha added, her elegant facade completely gone now. The blackmail, the business sabotage, the public humiliation. Arthur enjoyed watching us struggle. Helen could see how the situation had become desperate for both of them. Arthur hadn't been content with simple extortion. He'd been actively working to destroy the new identities they'd built while simultaneously bleeding them financially. So you decided to kill him? No. Ricky's denial was sharp and immediate. That's not what happened. Neither of us killed Arthur. Then what are you doing here? Tabitha opened her purse and pulled out a small digital recorder. Arthur kept recordings of our conversations, our confessions about the past. He used them to ensure we'd keep paying. We came here looking for his backup copies. He hid evidence here? He was paranoid about keeping everything in his shop where someone might find it, Ricky explained. He had a loose brick in the wall back here where he stashed things he didn't want discovered. Helen looked around the alley, trying to spot the hiding place. Did you find anything? The recordings are gone, Tabitha said. Either the police found them, or the real killer took them, Helen finished. Someone else who knew about Arthur's blackmail scheme. The implications were staggering. If Arthur had been blackmailing multiple people, any one of them could have committed murder to protect their secrets. The killer might have taken Arthur's insurance policy to prevent their own exposure. Who else was he blackmailing? Helen asked. Tabitha and Ricky exchanged another look, this one conveying shared knowledge they were reluctant to reveal. We don't know for sure, Ricky said carefully, but Arthur hinted that we weren't his only sources of income. He enjoyed talking about his retirement fund, Tabitha added with bitter emphasis. Said Maplewood was full of people with secrets worth protecting? Helen felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning temperature. Arthur's murder might be just the beginning if other victims of his blackmail scheme decided to eliminate potential witnesses. We need to call Sheriff Brady, she said, reaching for her phone. Wait, Tabitha said urgently. If this comes out, our pasts will be exposed anyway. The publicity from a murder trial will be worse if you're charged with Arthur's murder because you concealed evidence, Helen pointed out. Mike Brady is a fair man. He'll consider the circumstances. Before either of them could respond, Helen heard footsteps approaching the alley entrance. She turned to see Sheriff Brady himself, accompanied by 2 deputies, and looking grimmer than she'd ever seen him. Helen, step away from them, please, Mike said in his professional voice. Mike, wait, there's something you need to know about Arthur's blackmail scheme. We know about the blackmail. We found Arthur's records when we searched his apartment yesterday. Mike's expression was hard. What we want to know is which one of his victims decided murder was easier than paying. Tabitha straightened to her full height, summoning the dignity that had carried her through decades on stage. "Sheriff Brady, I won't pretend that Arthur Greaves wasn't a despicable man who made our lives miserable. But neither Ricky nor I killed him." "Then what are you doing at the crime scene?" Helen quickly explained about the hidden recordings and the search for evidence, watching Mike's expression shift from suspicion to thoughtful consideration. "Arthur kept recordings of his blackmail victims?" "And other evidence, apparently," Ricky said. "He was paranoid about protecting himself, but also about having leverage over people." Mike turned to one of his deputies. "Collins, get the crime scene team back here. I want every brick in this wall examined." He looked back at Tabitha and Ricky. "You two are coming to the station to give formal statements. And I want the names of everyone else you know or suspect Arthur was blackmailing." As the deputies began cordoning off the alley again, Helen found herself thinking about the larger implications of what they'd discovered. Arthur's blackmail scheme cast his murder in an entirely different light. Instead of a crime motivated by simple fraud or business disputes, it was likely the desperate act of someone whose entire life was threatened by exposure. "Helen," Mike said quietly, drawing her aside, "I need you to be extra careful over the next few days. If Arthur was blackmailing multiple people, and one of them has already committed murder—" "They might not stop with Arthur," Helen finished. "I understand." As she walked home with the dogs, Helen couldn't shake the feeling that Arthur's murder was part of a larger story that was still unfolding. Somewhere in Maplewood, other people were living with secrets that Arthur had discovered and exploited. One of them had decided that murder was preferable to continued extortion, and that person was still free to make similar decisions about anyone who got too close to the truth. The thought made Helen quicken her pace and look forward to the security of her locked front door. But even as she acknowledged the danger, she knew that the investigation was far from over. Arthur's hidden cache of blackmail material was missing, which meant the killer had been methodical enough to clean up after themselves. Such calculation suggested that Helen's amateur detective work might have attracted unwanted attention. She was unlocking her front door when she noticed something that made her blood run cold. A single gray and white striped feather was tucked under her doormat, placed with deliberate precision where she couldn't miss it. Helen stared at the feather, her mind racing. Sheriff Brady had said the voicemail might have been left by June's parrot, but if June was the killer, why would she leave such an obvious clue? Unless the feather wasn't a threat, but a message. June's parrot could mimic voices perfectly, which meant it might have overheard and recorded conversations between Arthur and his other blackmail victims. If June had discovered what her bird had witnessed, she might be trying to communicate with Helen without exposing herself to danger. Helen carefully picked up the feather and looked around her quiet neighborhood. Nothing seemed out of place, but she had the distinct feeling of being watched. Someone was paying very close attention to her investigation, and they wanted her to know it. She let the dogs into the house and immediately called Sheriff Brady. "Mike, someone left a parrot feather on my doorstep. I think June Butterworth is trying to tell me something." "Where are you now?" "At home, but I don't think I should stay here. If June's bird heard Arthur's conversations with his blackmail victims, it could identify the killer," Mike finished. "Helen, pack a bag. I'm sending a deputy to pick you up. You're staying at the station until we can sort this out." As Helen hurriedly packed an overnight bag, she found herself thinking about June Butterworth's exotic parrot. The bird that had seemed like an amusing eccentricity might actually be the key witness to Arthur's murder, and someone who knew that was now making sure Helen understood the stakes involved in her investigation. The game had changed from curious inquiry to deadly serious, and Helen was no longer sure she was clever enough to stay ahead of a killer who had already demonstrated their willingness to commit murder to protect their secrets. Chapter 6. The Voice of Truth. Helen spent Wednesday night at the police station, dozing fitfully in a chair in Sheriff Brady's office while Halo and Shadow curled up on the floor beside her. The building's unfamiliar sounds and the weight of her situation made sleep nearly impossible, but she was grateful for the security of thick walls and armed guards. Thursday morning brought news that confirmed her worst fears. June Butterworth had been found dead in her home, apparently the victim of a break-in gone wrong. Her house had been ransacked, and her beloved African gray parrot was missing. "It wasn't a burglary," Mike Brady told Helen over coffee in the station's break room. "Nothing valuable was taken except the bird. Someone wanted that parrot silenced permanently." Helen felt sick. "June was trying to warn me. That feather on my doorstep was her way of telling me the bird had evidence." "That's what we think, too. The question is whether she told the killer what her bird had overheard, or if they figured it out on their own." The implications were terrifying. Arthur's killer had now murdered June to prevent her parrot from revealing their identity. The methodical nature of both crimes suggested someone with the intelligence and ruthlessness to eliminate any threat to their freedom. "What about the parrot?" "We're searching, but—" Mike's expression was grim. If the killer took the bird, they probably destroyed it immediately. They wouldn't risk keeping a witness alive, even a feathered one. Helen thought about June's passion for her birds, her dedication to their care and protection. The woman who had spent 40 years studying and documenting avian behavior had died trying to expose a killer, and her beloved companion had paid the ultimate price for overhearing human evil. "There's something else," Mike continued. "The crime scene team found Arthur's missing blackmail materials in June's house, hidden in her bird room behind a cage." "June took them?" "It looks like she went to Arthur's hiding place before we sealed off the crime scene. She might have been trying to protect other victims, or gathering evidence to expose the killer." Helen felt the pieces of the puzzle rearranging themselves in her mind. June hadn't been Arthur's murderer. She'd been trying to solve his murder herself, using her parrot's unique ability to repeat overheard conversations. Her death was the act of a killer desperate to prevent exposure. "What did the materials contain?" "Names, recordings, documents. Arthur was blackmailing at least 6 people in Maplewood, including some we never would have suspected." Mike's voice was heavy with the weight of small-town secrets. "The killer is probably among them, but we'll need time to interview everyone and verify their alibis." "What about me? Am I still in danger?" "I think so. The killer knows you've been investigating, and they can't be sure what you've discovered. Until we make an arrest, you're staying under police protection." The next few days passed in a blur of interviews, statements, and tense waiting. Helen remained at the police station during the day and was escorted home each evening by a deputy who stayed overnight. The investigation expanded to include Arthur's other blackmail victims, revealing a web of secrets that stretched throughout Maplewood's seemingly innocent community. By Saturday morning, the police had narrowed their suspect list to 3 people who couldn't account for their whereabouts during both murders. Helen wasn't surprised to learn that all 3 were people she'd spoken with during her own investigation. Ricky Doyle, whose alibi for June's murder was particularly weak, a local accountant who'd been embezzling from his clients, and Dr. Sarah Chen from the medical clinic, whose prescription pad irregularities had made her vulnerable to Arthur's blackmail. "We're bringing them all in for formal questioning today," Mike told Helen over breakfast at the station. "One of them is our killer, but we need evidence beyond just opportunity." Helen was thinking about the missing parrot when inspiration struck. "Mike, what if the bird isn't dead?" "What do you mean?" "African greys can live for decades and they're valuable birds. If the killer took June's parrot to silence it, they might not have been able to bring themselves to actually kill it." Helen's excitement grew as the idea developed. What if they're keeping it somewhere, hoping it will eventually forget what it overheard? Mike's eyes lit up with understanding. If we could find the bird alive, it could still testify against the killer in its own way. The search for June's missing parrot became the investigation's new priority. Officers canvassed the town, looking for any sign of the distinctive gray bird or unusual behavior from the 3 remaining suspects. Helen, still under protective supervision, was allowed to participate by providing information about each suspect's possible hiding places. The breakthrough came Sunday evening, when a neighbor reported hearing what sounded like June Butterworth's voice coming from Dr. Chen's garage. The voice was repeating the same phrases over and over. which had struck the neighbor as odd since everyone knew June was dead. Sheriff Brady and his team surrounded Dr. Chen's property just as the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the suburban street. Helen watched from a patrol car as they approached the garage, where the sound of June's voice grew increasingly clear. But it wasn't June speaking. It was her parrot, repeating conversations it had overheard in its former home. And among the bird's repertoire of mimicked voices was one that made Helen's blood run cold. "Arthur, you can't keep doing this to people," the parrot said in Dr. Chen's voice. "It ends tonight." It was the same message that had been left on Arthur's answering machine, but now they could hear it clearly without electronic distortion. Dr. Chen had used June's parrot to make the threatening call, probably not realizing that the bird would remember and repeat her words. The final confrontation was anticlimactic. Dr. Chen, faced with her own voice being repeated by the bird she'd stolen, confessed to both murders with the resigned exhaustion of someone whose carefully constructed life had finally collapsed. She'd killed Arthur to end his blackmail over her prescription drug theft, then murdered June when she realized the parrot had overheard her conversations with Arthur. The bird had been hidden in her garage, where she'd been trying to decide what to do with the living evidence of her crimes. "I couldn't kill it," Dr. Chen told the police through tears. "I'm a doctor. I took an oath to do no harm. But I couldn't let it keep repeating what it had heard." As Helen watched Dr. Chen being led away in handcuffs, she felt a mixture of relief and sadness. The killer had been caught, Maplewood was safe again, and June's beloved parrot would be cared for by the local bird rescue organization. But 2 people were dead, and a respected member of the community had revealed herself to be capable of murder. The parrot, seemingly unaware of its role as a star witness, continued to chatter in June's voice as it was gently loaded into a transport carrier. Among its repertoire of sounds and phrases, Helen could hear June's patient instructions about bird care, her excited observations of migration patterns, and her gentle conversations with the bird she'd loved like family. It was a fitting tribute to a woman who had dedicated her life to understanding and protecting the creatures she studied. In death, June Butterworth had solved Arthur's murder through the intelligence and loyalty of the bird that had been her constant companion. Chapter 7. Sweet Resolution. 2 weeks after Dr. Chen's arrest, Maplewood was slowly returning to normal. The shocking revelation that their trusted physician had committed 2 murders to conceal her drug theft had left the community shaken, but the resilience that characterized small-town life was gradually reasserting itself. Helen had returned to her regular routine of morning walks with Halo and Shadow, though she found herself taking different routes to avoid the alley where Arthur had died and the street where June had lived. Some memories needed time to fade before they could be faced directly. She was experimenting with a new cranberry-orange scone recipe when Martha Kowalski called with news that made her smile for the first time in weeks. "Helen, you need to come to the town square right away. There's something wonderful happening." Curious and grateful for any distraction from her baking frustrations, Helen leashed the dogs and walked downtown. She found a small crowd gathered around the gazebo, where a familiar gray shape was perched on a specially constructed stand. June's African gray parrot, now named Phoenix by the bird rescue organization, was entertaining visitors with its remarkable vocabulary. But instead of the threatening phrases that had helped solve 2 murders, the bird was chattering about migration patterns, weather observations, and the joy of discovering rare species. "The rescue group says it's therapeutic for Phoenix to interact with people," Martha explained, as they watched children giggle at the bird's uncanny imitation of their teacher's voice. They think June would have wanted her bird to bring happiness rather than be remembered only for tragedy. Helen approached the stand carefully, not wanting to startle the intelligent creature that had played such a crucial role in recent events. Phoenix looked at her with bright, curious eyes and tilted its head in the universal bird gesture of interest. "Hello, Phoenix," Helen said softly. "Good morning. Beautiful day for birding," the parrot replied in June's enthusiastic voice. "Did you remember to bring your field guide?" The phrase brought tears to Helen's eyes, but they were good tears, a reminder of June's passion and dedication rather than the horror of her murder. Phoenix continued chattering, cycling through observations about weather patterns, feeding schedules, and the importance of protecting habitat for migrating species. As Helen watched the bird interact with fascinated visitors, she realized that Phoenix represented something important about Maplewood itself. The community had survived tragedy and emerged with its essential character intact. People were still capable of wonder, children still laughed at simple pleasures, and life continued with the stubborn persistence that made small towns special. Helen! She turned to see Ricky Doyle approaching with his usual friendly smile, though she noticed he looked more relaxed than she'd seen him in months. The end of Arthur's blackmail had freed him from the constant stress of maintaining his false identity while paying extortion. "I wanted to thank you," he said sincerely. "If you hadn't figured out what was really happening, I might still be under suspicion for murder. How are you doing with everything coming out about your past?" "Better than I expected, actually. Turns out people are pretty forgiving when they understand the whole story." Ricky's expression grew serious. "I'm working with a lawyer to make things right with the families who were hurt in Detroit. It won't undo the damage, but it's a start." Helen felt a warm glow of approval. One of the things she'd always loved about small towns was their capacity for redemption, their willingness to judge people by their current actions rather than their past mistakes. Tabitha Lane joined their conversation, looking elegant as always, but with a softer expression than Helen remembered from their earlier encounters. "I wanted to apologize for misleading you during your investigation," Tabitha said with the gracious dignity that marked everything she did. "I was so frightened of my past being exposed that I couldn't think clearly." "What will you do now?" "I'm considering returning to theater, actually. There's a community group in the next county that's looking for experienced directors. It might be time to stop running from who I used to be." As Helen watched Tabitha and Ricky talking with the easy camaraderie of people who had survived a crisis together, she reflected on the unexpected ways that Arthur's death had changed Maplewood. The secrets that had made people vulnerable to blackmail were now public knowledge, but instead of shame and rejection, the revelations had often led to understanding and support. Phoenix suddenly squawked loudly and launched into an elaborate description of optimal seed varieties for winter feeding, delivered in June's patient teaching voice. The crowd around the gazebo laughed, and Helen noticed that several people were taking notes, apparently planning to implement June's advice in their own bird feeding efforts. "She would have loved this," said a voice behind Helen. She turned to find Sheriff Brady, looking more relaxed than she'd seen him since the investigation began. The successful resolution of both murders had restored his confidence in Maplewood's fundamental safety, though Helen suspected he'd never again view their community as completely innocent. "Any word on Dr. Chen?" "She's cooperating fully with the investigation, helping us understand Arthur's full blackmail operation. Her lawyer thinks she'll get a reduced sentence in exchange for her testimony." Mike's expression was professionally neutral, but Helen could see his personal sadness about the situation. She was a good doctor before the addiction took over. It's a tragedy all around. Helen thought about the complexity of human nature, the way good people could make terrible choices when desperation overrode judgment. Dr. Chen had saved lives during her years of medical practice, but she'd also taken lives when her secrets were threatened. The contradiction was unsettling, but somehow very human. "What about Arthur's shop?" "His nephew from Chicago is handling the estate. Plans to auction off the inventory and sell the building." Mike paused. "Interesting thing, though. A lot of Arthur's so-called antiques turned out to be genuine after all. He was apparently selling real pieces as fakes to avoid paying proper taxes." The irony wasn't lost on Helen. Arthur's dishonesty had been so pervasive that even his fraudulent sales had sometimes involved real merchandise. He'd been cheating everyone, including himself, in his desperate attempts to maintain financial solvency. As the afternoon sun began to slant through the maple trees, casting the town square in golden light, Helen felt a sense of closure settling over her like a comfortable blanket. The investigation that had consumed her thoughts for weeks was finally complete. The killer was in custody, and Maplewood was healing from its brush with violence. Phoenix chose that moment to deliver a perfect imitation of June's voice, saying, "Remember, Every day is a good day for discovery if you keep your eyes open and your heart curious. The words seemed like a benediction, a reminder that life's mysteries didn't always end in tragedy. Sometimes curiosity led to wonder, investigation led to justice, and even the darkest secrets could be transformed into opportunities for redemption and growth. Helen gathered Halo and Shadow for the walk home, pausing to listen as Phoenix continued sharing June's wisdom with anyone willing to hear. The bird would never bring its beloved human back, but it could preserve her voice, her knowledge, and her passion for the natural world she'd studied so devotedly. As they strolled through the familiar streets of Maplewood, Helen found herself appreciating the simple pleasures that had attracted her to small-town retirement in the first place. The friendly waves from neighbors working in their gardens, the comfortable predictability of well-known routines, and the sense of belonging to a community where people cared about each other's welfare. Halo, apparently sensing her improved mood, celebrated by attempting to chase a particularly bold squirrel across 3 different yards before being gently redirected by his leash. Shadow maintained his dignified pace, but allowed his tail to wag with quiet contentment, as if he too understood that their world had returned to its proper balance. That evening, Helen baked a batch of apple cinnamon muffins using her grandmother's recipe, enhanced with the cardamom experimentation that had become her signature touch. As the familiar scents filled her kitchen and the 2 labs settled into their favorite spots on the cool tile floor, she felt profound gratitude for the ordinary moments that made up a peaceful life. The murders that had shattered Maplewood's tranquility were solved, but more importantly, the community had demonstrated its capacity for forgiveness, growth, and renewal. People like Ricky and Tabitha were finding ways to make amends for past mistakes. Phoenix was bringing joy instead of testimony to frightening crimes, and neighbors were supporting each other through the difficult process of healing. Helen settled into her favorite chair with a cup of tea and one of her fresh muffins, watching through the window as the last light of day painted everything in shades of amber and gold. Tomorrow would bring new routines, new small adventures with the dogs, and perhaps new mysteries to solve, though she hoped future puzzles would involve nothing more dangerous than perfecting difficult recipes or tracking down the source of neighborhood gossip. But tonight, she was content to simply exist in the peaceful aftermath of crisis survived and justice served. In a world that often seemed chaotic and unpredictable, Maplewood had reminded her that communities built on genuine care and mutual support could weather even the darkest storms. Phoenix's voice drifted through her open window, delivering June's patient instruction about the importance of maintaining clean bird feeders. A little effort every day prevents big problems later on. Helen smiled at the wisdom embedded in that simple observation. It applied to more than bird care. It described the daily attention and care that kept communities healthy, relationships strong, and life meaningful. Small acts of kindness, regular gestures of support, and the consistent choice to see the best in people rather than assume the worst. As she prepared for bed, Helen made a mental note to visit Phoenix again soon. The bird deserved to know that its testimony had brought justice for June, and that June's legacy of curiosity and compassion was living on through both the parrot's voice and the community's memory. Outside her bedroom window, Maplewood settled into its familiar nighttime quiet, secure once again in the knowledge that morning would bring nothing more threatening than the usual small-town dramas of weather complaints, minor political disagreements, and the eternal question of whose turn it was to organize the next community event. Helen fell asleep to the sound of Halo's gentle snoring and Shadow's occasional shifts on his bed, grateful for the companionship of her loyal dogs and the promise of another peaceful day in a town where the most exciting mystery was likely to involve nothing more dangerous than determining which neighbor had been secretly weeding other people's gardens. Epilogue: New Beginnings. 6 months after Arthur Greaves's murder, Helen Morrison stood in her kitchen preparing for the annual spring garden tour, rolling out dough for the lemon bars that had become her signature contribution to community events. Through her window, she could see Halo enthusiastically investigating the new growth in her flower beds, while Shadow supervised with the patient dignity of an experienced garden foreman. Maplewood had not only recovered from its brush with murder, but had emerged stronger and more connected than before. The revelation of so many hidden secrets had paradoxically brought people closer together, as neighbors who had been struggling with private burdens found support and understanding from their community. The doorbell rang, and Helen wiped her flour-covered hands on her apron before answering. She found a young woman standing on her porch, holding a small package and wearing the slightly nervous expression of someone about to ask a favor. "Mrs. Morrison, I'm Jennifer Walsh, June Butterworth's great-niece. I hope you don't mind me stopping by unannounced." Helen remembered hearing about June's relative, who had come to Maplewood to settle her great-aunt's affairs and had decided to stay, drawn by the community's warmth and the desire to continue June's work with local bird conservation. "Of course not, dear. Please come in. Can I offer you some coffee?" Jennifer followed Helen into the kitchen, where the scent of baking lemon bars created an atmosphere of domestic comfort. "Actually, I wanted to give you something. I've been going through Aunt June's papers, and I found this." She handed Helen a manila envelope, marked with her name in June's careful handwriting. Inside was a letter dated just 3 days before June's murder, along with a small, leather-bound notebook. Helen read the letter with growing amazement. "Dear Helen, if you're reading this, something has happened to me, and I hope it means my suspicions about Arthur's murder were correct and you were able to solve the case. I've been watching you investigate with the same methodical attention you once brought to perfecting your bakery's recipes, and I believe you have the instincts of a natural detective. The notebook contains my observations about several suspicious behaviors I've witnessed in Maplewood over the past year. I hope most of them are innocent, but if something happens to me, they might be useful to you or the police. I also wanted you to know that Phoenix has been trained to respond to specific phrases that might be useful in emergency situations. He's much more than just a mimic. He's genuinely intelligent and capable of providing help when properly directed. Please take care of our community, Helen. Maplewood needs people who pay attention to details and care enough to act when something isn't right. Your friend June." Helen felt tears prick her eyes as she finished reading. June had recognized her investigative instincts before Helen had recognized them herself, and had trusted her with information that might prove crucial in future emergencies. "There's something else," Jennifer said gently. "Phoenix has been asking for you. Well, not exactly asking, but he repeats your name often, usually followed by something about good detective work in Aunt June's voice. I think she trained him to remember you specifically." Helen looked up from the letter, intrigued. "Really? Would you like to visit him? He's living at the bird sanctuary now, but I think he'd enjoy seeing you, and—" Jennifer hesitated. "I was hoping you might consider helping me with something. Some of the things in Aunt June's notebook are concerning, but I'm not sure how to investigate them properly." Helen glanced at the notebook, then at the lemon bars that needed to come out of the oven in 10 minutes. Then at Halo and Shadow, who were both looking at her with the bright-eyed attention that suggested they sensed adventure in the air. "What kind of concerning things?" she asked, already knowing she was going to say yes. Jennifer opened the notebook to a page marked with a ribbon bookmark. Aunt June documented several instances of someone going through neighbors' trash at night. Always the same houses, always taking specific items. She also noticed unusual financial patterns among some of the businesses downtown. Places that should be struggling but seem to have more money than their customer base would suggest. Helen felt the familiar tingle of curiosity that had driven her investigation into Arthur's murder. After 6 months of peaceful routine, the prospect of a new mystery was surprisingly appealing. "And you think these observations might indicate criminal activity?" "I think Aunt June died before she could determine whether they were crimes or just unusual behaviors. But with everything that happened with Dr. Chen and Arthur's blackmail scheme—" Jennifer's voice trailed off meaningfully. Helen made her decision. "Let me finish these lemon bars for the garden tour, and then we'll go visit Phoenix. We can discuss your aunt's observations and decide what, if anything, needs to be investigated." As Jennifer smiled with relief and gratitude, Helen realized that retirement didn't necessarily mean the end of purpose or excitement. Maplewood might be a small town, but it was apparently full of mysteries, waiting to be solved by someone with the patience to observe, the wisdom to ask the right questions, and the courage to seek the truth, even when it led to uncomfortable places. She pulled the perfectly golden lemon bars from the oven and set them on the cooling rack, already planning how she might approach June's list of suspicious activities. Some things would require careful observation, others might need discreet inquiries among trusted neighbors, and a few might warrant bringing in Sheriff Brady if they proved to involve actual criminal behavior. Halo wandered into the kitchen and sat at Helen's feet, looking up at her with bright, expectant eyes that seemed to say he was ready for whatever adventure might come next. Shadow appeared a moment later, taking his customary position by her side, with the calm alertness of a trusted partner prepared for any eventuality. Helen looked around her cozy kitchen, filled with the sense of successful baking and the promise of community celebration, then at Jennifer, who was studying June's notebook with the intense focus of someone determined to honor her great-aunt's memory through action rather than just grief. "You know," Helen said thoughtfully, "I think June was right about Maplewood needing people who pay attention to details. And I suspect she planned this from the beginning, training Phoenix to remember me, documenting her observations, making sure someone would continue her work if anything happened to her." "You think she knew she was in danger?" "I think she knew that curiosity and investigation always carry risks, but that some things are too important to ignore." Helen smiled, feeling the satisfaction of understanding something that had puzzled her for months. June wasn't just a birdwatcher, Jennifer. She was Maplewood's unofficial guardian, keeping track of unusual patterns and behaviors that might threaten the community's safety. Jennifer nodded slowly. "And now she's passed that responsibility to you." Helen looked out her kitchen window at the peaceful street where neighbors were preparing their gardens for the spring tour, where children were playing safely in yards, and where the ordinary rhythms of small-town life continued with the comfortable predictability that made places like Maplewood so precious. But she also understood now that preserving that safety and predictability required vigilance, attention to detail, and the willingness to investigate when something didn't seem quite right. June Butterworth had spent years quietly observing and documenting, preparing for problems that might never come, but understanding that preparation was the price of protection. "I think you're right," Helen said finally, "and I think I'm ready to accept that responsibility." She sealed the lemon bars in containers for transport to the garden tour, made sure Halo and Shadow had fresh water, and gathered her purse and keys. There were mysteries to investigate, patterns to analyze, and a very intelligent parrot to consult about the art of careful observation. As they walked toward Jennifer's car, Helen found herself smiling at the unexpected turns her retirement had taken. She'd moved to Maplewood seeking peace and simplicity, but had instead discovered purpose, adventure, and the satisfaction of using her skills to protect the community she'd grown to love. Phoenix was waiting for them at the bird sanctuary, and when he saw Helen approaching, he tilted his head and delivered a perfect imitation of June's voice, saying, "Hello, my dear detective. Ready for the next case?" Helen laughed, realizing that some birds, and some people, were far more perceptive than anyone gave them credit for. "Yes, Phoenix, I think I'm ready." Behind her, she heard Halo bark with excitement and Shadow's dignified woof of approval. Even her dogs seemed to understand that their peaceful walks were about to become considerably more interesting. As she opened June's notebook and began reading the first entry about suspicious midnight activities on Elm Street, Helen felt the familiar stirring of curiosity and determination that had helped her solve Arthur's murder. Maplewood might appear to be a quiet, uncomplicated place, but appearances could be deceiving. And Helen Morrison, retired baker turned amateur detective, was just the person to look beneath those appearances and make sure her adopted hometown remained the safe, welcoming community it deserved to be. The mystery of the midnight trash collector would have to wait until after the garden tour, but Helen was already planning her approach to the investigation. Some questions required patience, observation, and the kind of methodical attention to detail that had made her a successful baker and, apparently, a natural detective. Phoenix squawked approvingly as she made notes in the margin of June's notebook, as if the intelligent bird understood that Helen was accepting the role of Maplewood's new unofficial guardian. The adventure was just beginning. The end.